if they are dragging their feet. But still, I would say Lord Stern has shown a very interesting thought figure in saying, what about low-carbon development strategies that contain an element what countries will do on their own because it's profitable for them, what they will contribute because they are citizens of the world, and what is the third element they will be able to do once they get the financial means to implement these actions. I think this would go a long way if developing countries would challenge the developed world with such ambitious plans to step up to the plate in terms of the funding. Now, on the financial support, I still see with the Swiss proposal, with the Norwegian proposal, funding mechanisms in the text on the table that would provide us important resources to complement the carbon market, and especially on aviation. I know it's very difficult to achieve an agreement on this, but unless, I would say, the developed world and the governments overcome the resistance of their finance ministers against these measures, we will have not agree on a good deal, and that this will be a hard and a tough decision to be taken by the leaders. And finally, the institutional framework and governments, I think we are to a large extent hampered in this process by a structure of the process which is still mirroring the kind of post-colonial division of the world in developed and developing countries. And at the same time, economically, we are in a big economic transformation where this structure is, a new world order, world economic order is emerging out of the higher growth worlds, at least in some parts of the developing world. Now, how the world comes to grip with, at the same time acknowledging this fact, this changing power structure in the world, and at the same time tackle climate change, I think will be defining on the outcome of Copenhagen. And to some extent, I am hopeful that the current bilateral talks between Washington and Beijing will be supportive of creating the political conditions for such a deal.
Thank you very much. And presumably, just to pick up on your last point, the major economies process, I think there's a meeting in Mexico today, actually, yes, is part of the answer to your last point there. Well, there's a lot there, but essentially I think the headline is that you've all been too pessimistic. Halldor,
yeah,
you kick off with that one.
Well,
these might be our sort of approaching our concluding remarks.
Exactly. Well, I love being told to be more optimistic, and you have to be optimistic to be in this business. And basically what you're suggesting is that the joint undertaking in terms of emission reduction in developing countries would be signed a number. So you would not, so you can report on the 19th of December not only what developed countries will be doing at home domestically, but also what would be the expected outcome of the joint undertaking by developed and developing countries. And that is, in a sense, combining the first and second political imperative that I outlined earlier. And NAMA's, for those that haven't picked up that acronym, that's Nationally Appropriate Mitigation Action, one of the jargons that we have put. And it's important also to remember that the numbers that have been coming out from industrialized countries, Japan, also the numbers that are coming from Congress in the US, are only looking at domestic action. They have not put a number yet on international action. And so that is the room for maneuver in terms of negotiating in Copenhagen. And so putting that in time of putting some numbers on likely delivery in that area is entirely possible. On this question of the scale, do you look at mitigation action or do you look at broader strategies? I think the caution I would put there is that once you start describing too much upfront how developing countries will go about their development and bringing down their emissions, it's going to bring up a lot of difficult debates that I'm not sure that will help us much. And so that's one of the reasons why I think that there is pushback on the low carbon development strategies, because they are seen as the North dictating how development should take place in the south. On the post-colonial structure, this is built into the convention. That's true. I don't think you will negotiate it away, but once you move further along this joint effort of moving on climate change, that distinction will become less and less relevant.
Thank you very much.
I'll take it.
You take a quick go at that, and then we'll take your question, and then...
So one of the things you find when you do these kinds of analyses is that the scale of reductions relative to emissions baselines that are required in the developing countries are probably larger than is what is required in the developed countries. So what you're thinking about, and when you say, oh, well, we'll make these domestic reductions of 15% below our current emissions, whatever it turns out to be relative to 1990, the scale of funding for emissions reductions in developing countries has to be the same or larger. This is the result of both our own work and the work of Project Catalyst. And that kind of money, agreeing how you're going to raise it and how you're going to spend it is a huge problem. You know, the developing countries say, look, put the money on the table and we'll figure out how to spend it. And the developed countries say, we're not going to give it to you unless you show you're going to spend it well. This is obviously a recipe for deadlock. However, it's a fundamental nature of the problem that we're going to have to confront. Jörg put it well, there is no other way to development other than low carbon development. The reverse is also true. There is no other way to development other than high carbon development. Nobody has ever demonstrated a country reaching a level of industrialization on less than about 2 to 2.5 tons of carbon per person per year. The maximum that will be allowed on an average for the developing countries, if we're to stay under 450 parts per million, is on the average of about 1.2 or 1.3 tons per person. So they're saying, look, you want us to do something that you haven't done. None of your countries have done it except with the possibility of enormous amounts of nuclear or hydropower, which we can't count on. And yet you want us to say we're going to commit to reducing to these levels before you've actually shown that it can be done. It's like, why isn't that working? So we have a long way to go. I am pessimistic in the short run, but optimistic in the long run. I do think it will take us not 6 months, but probably closer to 6 years before we can get to the kinds of targets that we need. But if we could reach an emissions peak by about 2015, we actually still have a way out of here, and I think that's actually possible. We won't see that negotiated in Copenhagen.
Let's just take one more question. Thank you. Freddie had his hand in the air first. Picked you to the post.